You missed a payment. It wasn't intentional. Funds are tight. Timing is off, and you tell yourself you'll take care of it soon. At first, it seems manageable, almost insignificant. A few days later, the system tries to reprocess your card. It doesn't go through. Then an email comes in your inbox. A simple reminder letting you know that something was missed and a balance still remains outstanding. You read it, acknowledge it, and move on. Life continues, so the urgency doesn't quite feel immediate yet. A few days later, a text message arrives, reinforcing what you already know. The tone is still neutral, but it's now becoming less easier to ignore. A week passes, and another message arrives. This time, a late fee has been added to the balance. The amount is no longer what it used to be. It's grown slightly, but still noticeably. You hesitate, knowing that you can't fully cover it yet, so it remains unpaid. Over the next few weeks, the communication changes. The emails become more frequent. First attempt, second attempt, third attempt. The language becomes more direct. What once was a friendly reminder is starting to feel more like pressure. Then the phone calls start. Unknown numbers, consistent timing, voicemails left, you return the call as soon as possible. This is no longer a quiet oversight, starting to feel like something is actively being pursued. Then you go get the mail. Letters are in the mailbox. Formal notices, clear statements, warnings about what's going to happen if the balance remains unresolved. The situation has moved beyond inconvenience. It's now becoming consequential. 1 month passes, then two, then three. Each cycle adds more weight. Late fees continue to accumulate. The interest continues to compound. What started as a single missed payment has now become something much larger, something harder to face. And then you get a knock at the door. You're asked to sign a document to acknowledge receipt. Legal action is now being considered. This problem has fully germinated into something more serious, something that demands your attention, whether you're ready or not. However, you continue to manage it quietly. You tell yourself, it's just a couple missed payments. You'll get caught up once things stabilize at work a little bit more. It doesn't quite feel urgent to disrupt your day, so you let it sit there a little while longer. The messages continue, but your response begins to shift. You glance at the text alerts without opening them. The emails get deleted before they're fully read. The phone rings off the hook and you let it pass, convincing yourself that you'll return the call once the money's in the account. Avoidance becomes your strategy. Not because you believe it solves anything, but because it creates temporary relief. For a moment, you're no longer confronted with the weight of what is still owed. At the same time, a subtle form of denial begins to take hold. You minimize the situation internally, telling yourself it hasn't quite reached a critical point. It's still manageable, right? Then another layer surfaces. You begin to question the structure itself. Why should payments be expected at this level of consistency when circumstances fluctuate? Why does the balance continue to grow when you're already behind? The situation starts to feel stacked against you, all while the interest continues to compound. The fees continue to accumulate. And now, what was just a simple obligation begins to feel like an impossible standard. Frustration turns outward. You begin to assign blame, not in necessary out of full conviction, but enough to soften the internal pressure. The system feels rigid. The expectations feel misaligned with reality. A quiet victim stance develops. You're kind of caught between responsibility and limitation, unsure how to move forward without feeling so overwhelmed. The situation no longer feels like something you created, but something that's happening to you, something you can't control. And yet, all beneath it all, the balance continues to grow, unaddressed, unresolved, and quietly expanding, regardless of how often it's avoided or reframed. What you just walked through isn't really about finances. It's about what happens when something owed goes unaddressed, and how quickly a single moment can evolve into a compounded burden. Relationships follow a remarkably similar pattern. When a mistake is made, whether that was a breach of trust, a broken agreement, a moment of poor judgment, there's often an unspoken sense that something is owed between two people. Not in a transactional sense, more in a relational one. Something was disrupted, something was taken, something was withheld or damaged. And until that disruption is acknowledged and repaired, it doesn't simply disappear. At first, the impact may seem manageable. It may even be minimized, dismissed, or quietly set aside, the same way you would put aside a missed payment. But internally, something has already registered, and the partner who is wronged begins to carry it. They may not express it immediately, but that experience is stored. It becomes part of how they interpret future interactions with you, whether they're conscious of it or not. And the one who made the mistake responds in a very similar way to a debt collector. There may be avoidance, justification, or just a quiet hope that time alone will resolve the tension. But just like an unpaid balance, the absence of repair does not neutralize the impact. Instead, the dynamic begins to shift. What once was a single moment becomes a reference point. What once was isolated begins to accumulate meaning. And over time, the relationship starts to carry the weight of something not fully resolved. In relational work, this dynamic is referred to as a breach of trust, followed by an emotional debt. More precisely, you could describe it as a relational rupture that now creates an outstanding emotional balance. That balance is not measured in dollars and cents, it's measured in acknowledgement, responsibility, reassurance, and repair. And until those elements are present, that sense of imbalance tends to remain, regardless of how much time has passed. This is where many couples get stuck. They're not dealing with a specific moment, the original rupture, anymore. They're navigating through the accumulation of what was left unresolved after the rupture happened. And just like that debt scenario, the longer it goes unaddressed, the more complex and weighty it becomes. Not because the original mistake was unforgivable, but because the repair never really materialized. Well, welcome to Mars Venus Coaching. I am your gender intelligence coach, Clay Smith. And in today's episode, we're going to explore the distinction between forgiveness and unforgiveness. How unresolved relational breaches quietly accumulate over time, and how they disrupt connection between two people. We're going to explore why grudges form in a relationship, the effects of unforgiveness has on trust and intimacy, and how intentional repair can transform a rupture into meaningful reconnection. By the end of the episode today, I want to leave you with one clear, practical first step that you can take towards resolving any imbalance in your relationship. Now, before we go further, it's important to establish the distinctive roles that often occur after a relational rupture. These roles are the impacted partner and the responsible partner. Clarifying this distinction will give us a shared language to navigate how unforgiveness forms and how repair begins. You see, the impacted partner is the one who experienced the hurt, the pain, or the disruption. They carry that emotional weight of what occurred. Their responses are shaped by the event and how it affected their sense of trust, safety, or connection. The responsible partner, that's the one whose action created the rupture. Their role is not defined by their identity, but by impact. They're the one navigating how to acknowledge what happened and take ownership and responsibility and make amends and participating in the restoration process. This distinction matters because it brings clarity without assigning fixed labels. It allows both partners to understand their position in the dynamic, while keeping the focus on responsibility and repair and forward movement rather than just blaming or criticizing their partner. With this distinction in place, we can now examine what happens between these two roles when that relational balance isn't fully paid off. What remains unresolved is like a seed left in the soil. Over time, it begins to take root, and that root often grows into unforgiveness. Unforgiveness, in its simplest form, is the decision to keep an emotional account open after a relational debt has been created. It's the internal posture of holding on to what is owed, allowing the impact of a past offense to remain active. In the context of a relationship, unforgiveness is often followed by a breach of trust. Something was disrupted, whether through betrayal, omission, or poor judgment, and that disruption created an, an imbalance that now seeks restoration and acknowledgement. When that repair is incomplete, or when it's not fully received, the account doesn't just close on its own, it remains on record, shaping perception, influencing responses, and quietly reappearing in future conversations. This is where that financial analogy becomes precise. Just as a unpaid balance continues to generate reminders, pressure to pay off, and accumulating those late fees, an unresolved relational debt continues to surface through tension, guardedness, and subtle echoes that the balance still remains unpaid. When that seed of unforgiveness has germinated, the impact on the responsible partner might be subtle at first, but becomes increasingly significant over time. What begins as accountability quickly turns into ongoing scrutiny, where past actions remain active in the present moment rather than just being resolved and released. Unforgiveness often shows up not in direct confrontation, but more so in indirect communication. Side comments, rhetorical questions, lightly delivered remarks begin to function like emotional collection notices, signaling the account is still open and under review. For the partner who made the mistake, the responsible partner, there can they can feel like an ongoing evaluation. There may be a sense that the relationship has entered a state of probation, where trust has not been fully restored, or where the past actions continue to influence present interactions. Just as someone tries to avoid a collection notice to escape the pressure, the responsible partner may begin to withdraw. Not because they're unwilling to repair, but because the environment no longer feels safe enough to re-engage. It's like the rich uncle that you avoid over the holidays because you still owe him $200. There's often a growing sense that nothing fully counts. Apologies, change behaviors, efforts to make amends may be partially acknowledged, but not fully received. This creates an internal experience of diminishing effort or return, where effort isn't really fully effective. Over time, this can shift motivation. Instead of moving towards connection, the responsible partner may begin focusing on avoiding missteps. The relationship becomes less about growth and more about not getting it wrong again. This is where resentment can quietly develop, such as frustration towards a lender who continually adds pressure to pay off the debt. The responsible partner may begin to feel that the standard is unattainable. The weight of the past begins to overshadow the possibility of progress. In many cases, communication begins to change. The responsible partner may become more guarded, less expressive, more reactive. Again, this isn't because they're unwilling to connect, but because they're anticipating that their efforts will be filtered through an unresolved past. This dynamic creates a reinforcing cycle. The more the impacted partner holds the debt in place, the more the responsible partner begins to disengage and protect themselves. And then that disengagement then can create a illusion of further evidence of the issue really hasn't been resolved. What was originally a single rupture begins to shape the entire relational atmosphere. Trust certainly can't be rebuilt because the conditions required to rebuild the trust have not yet fully been established. In this way, unforgiveness not only preserves the past, but it actively influences the present moment and limits the future. Now, let's shift gears here and take a look at the impacted partner, the one carrying the weight of what happened. While unforgiveness may feel like protection, it often comes with a price that isn't usually immediately visible, but deeply influential over time. Internally, the impacted partner can begin to live in a heightened state of vigilance. Trust has been disrupted. So the mind starts working to look for any ways to prevent further hurt. This can lead to overanalyzing behavior, reading into things, scanning for inconsistencies, and feeling unsettled, even in neutral moments. Emotionally, the original pain doesn't stay contained to the past. It resurfaces in future interactions with your partner because the wound has not fully been processed or healed. This can create a sense of emotional fatigue where the relationship feels heavier than it once did. There can also be a quiet tightening around vulnerability. Opening back up might feel risky, so the impacted partner may begin to withhold parts of themselves. I don't think out of a place of disinterest, more out of a place of self protection. Over time, this reduces emotional intimacy, even if the desire to reconnect is present. Unforgiveness can also shape identity within the relationship. The impacted partner may begin to see themselves primarily through a lens of what happened, which can keep the wound at the center of the relationship instead of allowing repair to take root. This can make it more difficult to move forward, even when the opportunity to do so awaits. Cognitively, narratives begin to solidify. Thoughts such as, this could happen again, or things will never be the same, begin to take over like a radio station. That's the only song that plays. These narratives aren't necessarily out of accuracy, but out of a feeling of consistency of what's unresolved. Over time, this internal state can feel exhausting. Imagine an affair where the partner who was betrayed, every day they woke up, they put in their VHS tape, and they watch the affair happen. For an hour and 45 minutes, they see in detail all of the steps their partner took to betray them. They started their day like that. Of course, they're going to feel like shit. Holding on to the past continually drains their energy from the present moment, leaving no room for connection, for healing, for the possibility of building something new. They say sometimes you have to let go of the old to make room for the new. The impacted partner is holding on to what happened in the past. They're unable to make room for what can happen in the future. In this way, unforgiveness not only preserves the memory of that rupture, it continues to influence their emotional state, their perception, their capacity to re-engage with the responsible partner. To bring this into a real-life context, consider using this framework in the context of an affair. In many cases, an affair doesn't begin as a deliberate attempt to damage the relationship, but more as an attempt to meet needs that have gone unmet in the relationship. Instead of engaging in direct, vulnerable conversations about what is missing, one partner may start seeking meeting those needs outside the relationship. For example, a partner who is lacking emotional connection may unconsciously seek elsewhere to feel heard, seen, validated, valued, understood. When the affair is emotional or physical, it reflects an attempt to meet those needs, that internal deficit, without having a real life conversation to their partner about not getting those needs met. Well, when the breach is revealed, the roles have become clear. There is the impacted partner carrying the weight of the betrayal, and the responsible partner, now tasked with acknowledging the rupture, participating in repairing what was disrupted. In many cases, The responsible partner may apologize, take ownership, commit to changing their behavior. They may become more attentive, more intentional, more aligned with the expectations of a committed relationship. However, if unforgiveness remains present, the impacted partner may begin to respond in ways that reflect the original imbalance. They may withhold physical affection, reduce emotional openness. There may be a reluctance to fully re-engage. Although these responses are protective, they also carry consequences. This is where the dynamic becomes cyclical. The very needs that went unmet, which contributed to the original rupture, can begin to resurface if the relationship doesn't fully restore that emotional connection. The responsible partner, despite all of their efforts to repair, may begin to feel that access towards connection remains limited. And over time, this can create a very familiar tension where needs are again present but not fully met in the relationship. Now, this does not justify the original breach, but it does illustrate how unresolved emotional debt can recreate the conditions that made the relationship vulnerable in the first place. I'll say it again. Unforgiveness, in this sense, does not simply hold on to the past. Over time, it quietly influences the present moment and begins reshaping the future. If the underlying balance isn't paid in full, the unresolved patterns can prevent full reconnection and increase the likelihood that similar dynamics will reappear. This now makes sense why you see relationships who have 3 or 4 or 5 affairs. The partner that cheated in the relationship comes back, is now punished. Those needs don't get met. So again, they shop elsewhere. Again, that doesn't justify a betrayal. It just brings clarity as to why affairs happen. Now, let's understand why couples choose not to forgive. Even if both partners say they want to move forward, there are often deeper psychological and emotional behaviors at play that make forgiveness seem more difficult, premature, or even unsafe. One of the most common reasons for unforgiveness is the need to authentically heal. After a significant breach, the impacted partner may begin to not feel ready to just release the offense because that emotional wound is still active. Forgiveness in this stage can feel less like resolution and more like just bypassing something that has yet not been processed. Another major factor is fear. This can be a concern that offering forgiveness too quickly may signal that the behavior was acceptable, or it lowers the barrier for another mistake to happen again. In that sense, unforgiveness can feel like a form of protection, a way of maintaining those boundaries when trust has been compromised. There is also, at times, a sense that consequences are needed to restore balance. When someone has been deeply hurt, there can be an unconscious pull to ensure that the other person fully understands the weight of the impact. This can show up as a desire to withhold, delay, or extend the process. So the experience is felt and acknowledged at a deeper level. In some cases, this can move into a subtle form of punishment. Not always intentional, but as an attempt to restore a sense of fairness. The underlying message could be, if I felt this way, you should feel a similar version of it as well. However, punishing your partner prolongs the recovery process rather than repairing it. There's also a concept captured by a German word called Schadenfreude. This refers to taking pleasure in another person's pain. In relationships, this can surface subtly when the impacted partner unconsciously wants the responsible partner to feel the weight of what they experienced, as a way to restore the balance or validate the pain. If you'd like a deeper understanding of how this dynamic can slowly erode connection over time, I encourage you to watch my earlier episode on the vicious cycle. I'll leave a link in the description box below. Identity can also play a role. The impacted partner may anchor part of their experience in being the one who was wronged. Letting go of the offense could feel like letting go of that victim position, which could create an internal resistance, even if reconciliation is desired. There's also the significance of the narratives. If the story becomes centered around what happened, forgiveness can feel like contradicting the story rather than expanding beyond it. The mind tends to preserve consistency, even when that consistency limits growth. Now, from a gender intelligence perspective, there can be some nuanced differences in how unforgiveness shows up. For many women, unforgiveness may be more likely tied to emotional safety. If the relational environment doesn't feel secure, consistent, or attuned, forgiveness may feel premature because the underlying need for that safety isn't been provided. For men, unforgiveness is more often connected to trust and respect, in reliability. If a core expectation has been broken, there can be a hesitation to release the offense until there is clear evidence that stability, follow through have been fully reestablished. Forgiveness in this case can be contingent on restoration rather than emotional processing. These aren't cold, hard facts or absolute rules, but common patterns. Regardless of gender, each person is ultimately seeking a sense of safety, connection, and balance. They may simply arrive there different pathways. Understanding these underlying reasons does not justify staying stuck, but it does create clarity around why unforgiveness unconsciously feels compelling, even if both partners authentically want to move ahead. And once we understand that resistance, we can now begin to look about what becomes possible when that resistance is removed. This leads us to exploring what forgiveness actually is. Forgiveness, at its core, is the intentional choice to release the emotional debt created by that past offense. I always say that forgiveness is to love the other person as if before the offense. To forgive is to love them as if before the offense occurred. Now, this is not a denial of what happened. This is not a minimization of its impact, but the choice to close the account so the balance no longer carries forward and disrupts the present moment. Before the offense, the impacted partner wasn't repeatedly replaying the rupture in their mind. They weren't mentally rehearsing what happened, revisiting the details, and reliving the emotional weight of the experience over and over again. Now, because that past wasn't being constantly replayed, it wasn't affecting them negatively. There was more freedom to engage, connect, and respond. This is the part of forgiveness as it restores a relationship. It doesn't erase the memory, but it does remove the offense from being at the center of the relationship. So the past no longer directs the tone, the posture, and the emotional availability of the present moment. Before the offense, there was openness. There wasn't a need to monitor your spouse. There wasn't accumulation of reminders. There wasn't a sense that something unresolved is quietly growing beneath the surface. Forgiveness is the return to that posture. Again, it's not forgetting about the transaction, but it's recognizing that it has been fully addressed. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have boundaries. It, it does not mean that trust is just instantly restored or that discernment is now removed. It does mean the relationship is no longer operating under the weight of what happened. In practice, forgiveness looks like releasing the need to send reminders, to reintroduce the past, or to keep the account open. It is the movement from collection to closure, where the emotional equivalent of the phone calls and the notices and the accumulated pressure no longer defines the relationship. Now, before we move into how to forgive, it's important to clarify what forgiveness is not. Many people resist letting go based off of some popular misconceptions of what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not saying that what happened doesn't matter. It doesn't minimize the impact of the offense or erase the significance of the experience. Forgiveness is also not an immediate restoration of trust. Trust is rebuilt through consistent behavior change over time. Forgiveness is the decision to cancel the debt so the rebuilding process can actually begin. Forgiveness does not mean immediate vulnerability. It is first from a place of that inner posture, not from just this instant return to trust and complete openness or unrestricted emotional access. Another common misconception is that time alone will resolve what's been broken. There's a belief that, if you just wait long enough, the wound will naturally heal on its own. Forgiveness will kind of happen naturally. Over time, by itself, doesn't close an account. If anything, waiting without intentional repair will multiply the debt, allowing the emotional equivalent of interest to compound as the unresolved experience continues to permeate the tension between two partners, the perception limiting their connection. This is where the root of bitterness begins to form. When the balance remains unpaid and the experience is left unaddressed, it doesn't just stay dormant, it quietly takes root beneath the surface, growing over time as those unresolved hurts continue to shape how each person sees the other person. Now, we've just taken a look at where this dynamic leads if nothing changes. We've seen how the cost of unforgiveness quietly compounds over time, and how that root of bitterness continues growing beneath the surface. But to understand why this pattern persists, we need to consider that what unforgiveness appears to offer in the moment. There are perceived payoffs that can make unforgiveness feel protective, even as it slowly erodes a relationship. Let's take a moment to project this dynamic forward. If nothing changes, if the balance remains open, and that root of bitterness is left unaddressed, what does that look like 6 months down the road? How about a year? How about a decade down the road? At first, the relationship is still intact. I mean, you're still together, still functioning, still navigating daily life together. But beneath the surface, something begins to shift. That root continues to grow. Each unresolved moment reinforces the last, deepening the emotional disconnect, making it more difficult to separate the present from the past. What was once a specific event now becomes the lens through which the relationship is experienced. Connection begins to erode gradually. Conversations become more guarded. Emotional openness decreases. Small moments of tension carry more weight than they should. Not because of what happened now, but because what happened in the past. Like one of my clients told me regarding unforgiveness, he said, sometimes it feels like there's just a dark cloud that looms over our home. Trust doesn't rebuild on its own. Without intentional repair and release, it slowly weakens. And not always in obvious ways either, but in subtle shifts, in tone, energy dynamics, and a willingness to fully re-engage. Over the time, the relationship kind of just starts to feel heavier due to all of that accumulation of the account of what's still unsettled. There's less ease, less lightness, less freedom in how each partner relates to one another. In some cases, distance becomes the new normal. Not in a single decision, but more in a series of small adjustments designed to protect each other against further hurt. Each partner adapts, but in doing so, they move further away from the connection that initially brought the relationship together. This is the cost of leaving the debt unpaid. It's not always immediate, but it is cumulative, quietly reshaping the relationship over time, until what once felt like connection begins to feel constrained and unsustainable. This is why action is required now, because the longer the root remains, the deeper it grows. Like a tree whose roots slowly spread beneath a concrete foundation, bitterness can remain quiet and reserved for a time, but if left unaddressed, eventually it will break up that concrete and fracture the foundation of what seems solid. Unforgiveness often remains in place because at some level it feels like it's providing some type of valuable payoff. It feels like protection, control, stability. In a moment where there's where those things have been disrupted. Here are some common alleged payoffs that the impacted partner may experience when they choose not to forgive. Unforgiveness can feel like protection. Holding on to the offense can create a sense of guarding against future pain, as if reminding yourself of the debt somehow prevents it from happening again. Unforgiveness can create a sense of control. After a breach of trust, the dynamic often feels uncertain. Unforgiveness can restore a sense of leverage, where the impacted partner feels less vulnerable and more in control of the emotional direction of the relationship. Unforgiveness can validate the pain. Keeping the account open can feel like honoring what happened, ensuring that the pain is not minimized or dismissed or forgotten about. It reinforces that the experience mattered. Unforgiveness can establish accountability. There may be a belief that if the debt remains active, then the accountable partner will continue to stay aware, attentive, and aligned, rather than becoming complacent or perhaps repeating their behavior. Unforgiveness can preserve a sense of justice. It can feel like maintaining fairness, where the consequences match the weight of the offense, rather than letting your partner off the hook. Unforgiveness can shape identity. The impacted partner may unconsciously hold on to the role of being wronged, which will provide a sense of clarity or moral groundedness in the relationship dynamic. Unforgiveness can delay vulnerability. Letting go of the offense requires reopening emotionally. Unforgiveness creates that distance that feels safer, rather than risking being hurt again. Considering all of these payoffs, here is the real trade-off. While it feels like protection, what it's actually doing is keeping the relationship anchored to the very moment both partners are trying to move beyond. It maintains the debt rather than resolving it. And in doing so, it can quietly limit connection, reduce emotional safety, and prevent the kind of reconnection both partners ultimately want. At this point, you can see how these patterns form, why it persists, and what it ultimately costs. But there, the shift here matters most is that forgiveness is not something that happens by accident. It's a process. Like any process, it can be understood and intentionally applied. This means that you're not waiting for the right moment or for the right conditions or the right feeling to arrive. You can begin moving towards resolution in a structured way, one step at a time, and clarity around what actually restores the balance will help rebuild your connection. So, before that can happen, what needs to be in place is an ability to process these feelings. Forgiveness doesn't happen by accident, and your partner doesn't need to be involved in this setting. It begins with creating space to feel and release what you are carrying. Now, rather than leaving these theories and concepts to you, we're going to put this into a practical action step. As I mentioned earlier, I want to leave you with one clear action step that you can take to begin closing the account and moving the relationship forward. Drumroll, please. That is to write a feeling letter, your favorite thing. A feeling letter is a structured framework designed to process and express difficult emotions on paper in a safe and constructive way. It guides you through a simple sequence that helps you articulate what you are feeling, bringing clarity to the experience and releasing the emotional intensity before engaging with your partner or the person that hurt you. This process not only reduces the likelihood of reactive conversations, but also creates space for deeper understanding and more intentional communication. By engaging in this grief work, that I like to call it, you can mentally revisit the pain or difficult moment, but this time move through it with greater clarity, closure, and the possibility of forgiveness. Now, I don't have time in this episode to go over the 3 parts of the feeling letter process, so I encourage you to watch my earlier episode entitled The Feeling Letter Technique. It's in the description box below. It's about a 20 or 30-minute video. It walks you through the specific stages of the feeling letter process. Sometime this week, commit to listening to that tutorial. Then, take what you learned, set some time aside, and write out your feelings on paper through that structured format of the feeling letter. Take your feeling letter, feel free to burn it. This isn't to give to your partner. This is to get those emotions out in that structured way. Feel the feelings. What you feel, you can heal. And as you process those emotions and get to the place of forgiveness, that is where that root of bitterness begins to get choked out. The root of bitterness does not usually disappear because time has passed. It begins to loosen when what has been carried is finally acknowledged, processed, and felt with intention. That is why the feeling letter is such a valuable starting point. It brings you to a place of honesty where you could express those emotions that are causing any distance between you and your partner. It allows you to slow the process down, identify that area that has been unresolved, separating out the original hurt from last week's episode that blew up in the relationship. Forgiveness not only imagines the offense never happened, but it is about deciding to love that person as if before the offense occurred. It's choosing not to keep the account open. It's the decision to close the account, process it honestly, and no longer have it control your connection with your significant other. When couples learn to do this, a relational rupture doesn't have to turn into resentment. Pain doesn't have to become punishment. And what was once a source of distance can become an opportunity for deeper honesty, clear repair, and authentic reconnection. So this week, I want to encourage you, take that first step. If this is something there's unresolved between you and your partner, begin with a feeling letter. Give yourself that space to process those emotions of what you're carrying, put it out on paper before going back and having that recovery conversation with your partner. I highly recommend you apply this insight in your relationship. If you'd like to book a complimentary clarity session with me to further understand how to apply this principle, feel free to click the link in the description box below. If you feel like forgiveness is difficult because the pain still feels unresolved. A complimentary clarity session will give us space to walk through the feeling letter process together, identify what is still emotionally active beneath the surface. We can clear up what upset you in the moment, but then link that back to what was never resolved. What's causing the resentment, the judgment, or the guilt? And begin creating a healthy path forward towards repair, release, and reconnection. If you received value from our episode today, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. On a monthly basis, I send out new relationship tools and communication strategies to help couples stay connected. Also, if you've been applying this tool in your relationship, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comment section below. Let's stay connected through paying attention to when the past keeps resurfacing in your relationship. When old wounds continue to reshape or reappear in conversations, resentments, or moments of distance, it's usually a sign that there's an emotional debt that still feels unresolved. Remember, holding on to the past or unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. If you notice yourself or your partner repeatedly bringing up the past, it's an invitation to slow down, revisit the feeling letter process, and begin learning to forgive towards reconnecting.